The conference room on the 47th floor overlooked a city that never stopped moving, never stopped building, never stopped chasing the next billion-dollar dream. Marcus Whitfield stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection barely visible against the sprawling skyline of glass and steel towers that stretched toward a cloudless September sky. His hands were steady, his jaw set with the kind of confidence that comes from closing deals most men only fantasize about. Behind him, leather chairs surrounded a mahogany table so polished you could see your future in it, or at least the future Marcus thought he was securing. In exactly 47 minutes, he would sign the largest commercial real estate agreement in the company's 60-year history, $500 million. The kind of number that changes legacies, that puts your children's children through any university they choose, that buys retirement homes in 3 countries and still leaves enough to fund a hospital wing with your name on it. But right now, before we go any further, I need you to do something. Type your country in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching this from, because this story crosses borders, crosses cultures, and what happened in that building could happen anywhere power and greed intersect. Hit that subscribe button too, because you're about to hear a story so unbelievable, so perfectly timed, that if I didn't have the documentation to prove it, I wouldn't believe it myself. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the most important truth. Marcus had spent 18 months on this deal. 18 months of flying between continents, of dinners that cost more than most people's monthly rent, of negotiations that stretched past midnight and picked up again at dawn. The property was a commercial complex in Abu Dhabi, 3 interconnected towers that would house corporate headquarters, luxury retail, and premium residential units. The plans showed buildings that looked like they belonged in a science fiction film, all sweeping curves and reflective surfaces that would catch the desert sun and throw it back at the sky in defiance. The seller was represented by Al Hashimi Holdings, a family conglomerate with roots going back 4 generations and tentacles reaching into shipping, construction, oil services, and now prime commercial real estate. Khalid al-Hashimi himself would be arriving within the hour, along with his legal team, his financial advisors, and an entourage that Marcus had learned was customary for deals of this magnitude in the Gulf region. Everything was ready. The contracts had been reviewed by 3 separate law firms. The financing was secured through a consortium of international banks. The wire transfer protocols were established. The ceremonial pens, yes, they actually had special pens for a $500 million signature, sat in velvet-lined boxes that probably cost more than the average person's car. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew as they checked their phones and straightened their ties and mentally rehearsed their handshakes, was that 7 floors below them, in a service corridor that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and recycled air, a truth was being uncovered that would detonate through their perfectly constructed deal like a grenade through glass. Maria Santos had been cleaning office buildings for 11 years. She started when her daughter Lucia was just 7 years old, working nights so she could be home when Lucia got back from school, sleeping in fragments between shifts, building a life 1 clean toilet and polished floor at a time. She was 43 but looked older, the way hard work ages you in places photographs can't capture. Her hands were rough from chemicals. Her back carried a permanent ache that flared up when the weather changed. But her mind was sharp, sharper than most of the executives who walked past her without seeing her, who discussed million-dollar margins while she emptied their trash cans and wiped down their conference tables. Maria had learned that invisible people hear the most interesting things. This particular morning, Maria was restocking paper towels in the executive washroom on the 47th floor when she heard voices coming from the adjacent conference room. The walls in these modern buildings were thinner than they looked, all style over substance and sound carried in strange ways through the ventilation systems and ceiling panels. She recognized Marcus Whitfield's voice immediately. He was always polite to her, always said good morning, which was more than most of them did. But there was another voice she didn't recognize, speaking English with an accent she thought might be British, discussing something about the timeline for the clauses and ensuring the language remains buried in the technical amendments. Maria had learned long ago that when people talked about bearing language, they weren't planning a funeral. They were planning a trap. She paused, her hand frozen halfway to the paper towel dispenser, and listened more carefully. The British voice was explaining something about Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C, the kind of legal coordinates that made most people's eyes glaze over, which was exactly the point. He was describing how the Arabic translation contained specific provisions that weren't present in the English version, provisions that would only activate under certain market conditions, provisions that would essentially transfer majority operational control to Al-Hashimi Holdings if the property values dropped below a calculated threshold within the first 36 months. Maria's English was good, better than people assumed, but some of the legal terminology flew past her understanding, like birds she couldn't catch. What she did understand was the tone, the way the British voice dropped lower when he said, "They'll never notice it unless they have native Arabic speakers cross-referencing every technical paragraph, and their legal team doesn't have anyone with that specific dialect expertise." What she understood was the laugh that followed, not quite malicious, but definitely satisfied, the sound of men who believed they were smarter than everyone else in the room. Maria finished stocking the paper towels with hands that had started to shake slightly. She pushed her cleaning cart back toward the service corridor, her mind racing through possibilities and problems. Who could she tell? Who would believe her? She was a cleaner. She cleaned toilets for a living. If she walked into that conference room and interrupted a $500 million deal with accusations based on a conversation she'd overheard while restocking bathroom supplies, they would smile politely and call security. Or they wouldn't smile at all. They would just call security. But Maria had a daughter who was now 18 years old, who had just finished her first year of university studying international law and linguistics. A daughter who spoke 4 languages fluently, including Arabic, which she'd learned partly out of academic interest, and partly because she'd befriended a group of Arab students who invited her to their cultural events and taught her phrases over coffee and late-night study sessions. A daughter who understood what phrases like buried provisions and dialect-specific language actually meant in the context of international commercial law. Maria made a decision that would either save Marcus Whitfield's company millions of dollars or cost her the job that kept food on their table and Lucia in university. She pulled out her phone, her rough fingers fumbling slightly with the touchscreen, and called her daughter. Lucia answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular blend of youth and exhaustion that comes from staying up too late studying for exams you can't afford to fail. "Mama, is everything okay? You never call during your shift." Maria kept her voice low, aware that sound carried strangely in these corridors, aware that she was probably already taking too long on a phone call when she should be moving to the next floor. "Lucia, I need you to listen carefully. I need you to come to the Meridian Tower building right now. I need you to bring your Arabic textbooks, the ones from your advanced commercial translation course, and I need you to trust me that this is important, more important than whatever you had planned for today." There was a pause, and Maria could practically hear her daughter's mind working through the strangeness of the request, weighing it against years of trust, against the fact that Maria had never asked for something like this before. "I'm on my way," Lucia said finally. 20 minutes if the subway cooperates." "Mama, are you in trouble?" Maria looked down the corridor toward the service elevator, then back toward the executive floor, where men in suits were about to sign away their futures. "No, mija, but someone is about to be, and they don't even know it yet." 23 minutes later, Lucia Santos walked into the Meridian Tower lobby, carrying a backpack full of textbooks and a head full of questions. She was young enough that the security guard barely glanced at her student ID, old enough that she'd learned to move through the world with a confidence that came from knowing she was smarter than people expected. Her mother met her at the service elevator, looking more stressed than Lucia had seen her in years, and that was saying something because stress was practically Maria's default expression. "Mama, what's going on?" Lucia asked as they rode the elevator up, the cable humming through the shaft like a nervous system made of steel. Maria explained what she'd heard, tripping over some of the legal terms, but getting the essential facts across. A massive deal, a hidden clause, a translation discrepancy. Men who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. Lucia's eyes widened as the implications clicked into place, like puzzle pieces forming a picture she didn't like the look of. That's fraud, she said quietly. Or at least it's fraudulent misrepresentation. If they're deliberately using translation differences to hide material terms, that could void the entire contract. Mama, this is serious. This is criminal serious. The elevator stopped on the 47th floor. Maria led her daughter through the corridors. She knew better than most people knew their own apartments, past the executive offices and private meeting rooms, toward the conference room where Marcus Whitfield was probably checking his watch and mentally rehearsing his signature. They could hear voices now, louder than before, the formal greetings and pleasantries that preceded historical business moments. Arabic phrases mixed with English in a linguistic dance that Lucia recognized from her studies. They were close, too close to turn back now. Maria made another decision, the kind that separates people who survive from people who actually live. She knocked on the conference room door. The conversation inside stopped like someone had hit a pause button on reality. There was a long moment of silence, and then the door opened. A young man in an expensive suit looked down at Maria with the kind of expression that suggested he was trying to place her in a category his brain would accept. Cleaner. Obviously cleaner. Why was a cleaner knocking on the door during the most important meeting of the quarter? I'm very sorry to interrupt, Maria said, her accent thicker when she was nervous, but her voice steady. But there is something Mr. Whitfield needs to know before he signs any documents today. Something about the Arabic translation. The room behind the young man had gone very quiet. Marcus Whitfield appeared at the door, his expression caught between confusion and annoyance, and then recognition. Maria! What's this about? This was it, the moment when Maria could back down, apologize for the interruption, and retreat back to the safety of cleaning carts and minimum wage anonymity. Or she could step forward into a space where cleaners weren't supposed to exist and speak truth to power before power made a $500 million mistake. Mr. Whitfield, she said, this is my daughter, Lucia. She studies international law and commercial Arabic translation. I heard something this morning, something about the contract you're about to sign, about differences between the English and Arabic versions. I think you need to listen to what she has to say. I think you need to listen right now before you sign anything. Marcus looked from Maria to Lucia, and Lucia could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was insane. This was unprofessional. This was a cleaner and her college student daughter interrupting the biggest deal of his career with vague warnings about translation discrepancies. Any rational person would politely decline and get back to business. But Marcus Whitfield hadn't built a career on ignoring gut instincts. And something about Maria's expression, about the way her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice remained steady, made him hesitate. You have 2 minutes, he said finally. And this better be important, because we have a room full of very important people waiting for a very important signature. He stepped aside and let them in. The conference room was exactly as impressive as Lucia had imagined, maybe more so. The mahogany table, the leather chairs, the windows overlooking a city that looked small and manageable from this height, and the people. Khalid al-Hashimi sat at the head of the table, radiating the kind of authority that comes from generations of wealth and power. His legal team flanked him, 4 men in suits that probably cost more than Lucia's entire year's tuition. On the other side, Marcus's team looked equally polished, equally expensive, equally confident that they knew exactly what they were doing. The contract sat in the middle of the table, like an altar waiting for devotion. Lucia felt every eye in the room focus on her, felt the weight of judgment and skepticism, and barely concealed annoyance. She was a 19-year-old college student in jeans and a university hoodie, standing in a room where the average age was probably 50 and the average net worth was probably 50 million. She took a breath and began. My name is Maria Santos, and I study international commercial law with a specialization in Arabic translation at the State University. My mother overheard a conversation this morning about potential discrepancies between the English and Arabic versions of this contract. Specifically, she heard references to Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C, and language that might be, quote, buried in the technical amendments. I don't know who she heard saying this, and I don't know if it's true, but if there are material differences between the language versions of this contract, That's a serious legal issue. Before any signatures happen, I would strongly recommend that a qualified Arabic translator review both versions line by line to ensure they're saying the same thing. The room erupted. Not loudly because people at this level of business don't shout, but the temperature change was unmistakable. Khalid al-Hashimi said something in rapid Arabic to one of his lawyers. Marcus's chief legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had a reputation for missing nothing, leaned forward with an expression that had gone from annoyed to intensely focused. The British man Lucia didn't recognize had gone very pale, which told her everything she needed to know about whether Maria had heard correctly. Marcus held up a hand for silence. Patricia, do we have Arabic speakers on our legal review team? Patricia shook her head slowly. We used a standard translation service for the Arabic version, certified and bonded. We reviewed the English version exhaustively. Standard practice is that both versions are considered equally binding, and any disputes would be resolved by international arbitration favoring the English language version per Section 23. Lucia jumped in before she could lose her nerve. But Section 23 might itself be different in the Arabic version. And if the Arabic version contains additional clauses or modified language, especially regarding operational controller value thresholds, then certification doesn't matter. What matters is what the actual text says. May I see the documents? There was a long moment where nobody moved, where $500 million hung in the balance between pride and prudence. Then Khalid al-Hashimi did something unexpected. He laughed. Not mockingly, but with what seemed like genuine appreciation. He said something in Arabic, and one of his lawyers translated. Mr. Al-Hashimi says the young woman is smarter than most of the expensive lawyers in this room. He says if there is nothing to hide, there is nothing to fear from examination. He invites her to review both versions. The British man, whose name Lucia would later learn, was Jeremy Ashford, and who was a consultant brought in specifically to handle the Arabic language provisions, started to object. This is highly irregular. We have schedules to maintain, protocols to follow. We can't simply allow a random student to, but Khalid cut him off with a gesture, still speaking Arabic, which his translator rendered as, if our contract cannot withstand the scrutiny of a university student, then it does not deserve to be signed by serious businessmen. The Arabic and English versions of the contract were placed in front of Lucia. They were massive documents, each running over 200 pages, filled with the kind of dense legal language that made normal human communication look like poetry. Lucia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd studied commercial Arabic, yes. She'd translated contracts in her coursework, yes. But nothing on this scale. Nothing with this much money at stake. Nothing where a mistake on her part could destroy her mother's job and her own credibility before her career even started. She started with Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C, since that's what Maria had mentioned. The English version discussed standard operational management protocols and fiduciary responsibilities. Corporate governance language that looked completely normal. The Arabic version, she read it once, read it again, felt her stomach drop. The Arabic version contained an additional 4 sentences embedded in the middle of what looked like standard boilerplate language that created an entirely separate operational control mechanism. If the property value, as determined by a specific Dubai-based assessment firm that happened to be owned by a subsidiary of Al-Hashimi Holdings, fell below 85% of the purchase price at any point during the first 36 months, operational control would transfer to Al-Hashimi Holdings pending a restructuring review. The restructuring review process was defined in another section, Section 18, which Lucia flipped to immediately, and that process could take up to 5 years to complete. 5 years during which Al-Hashimi Holdings would effectively control a property that Whitfield's company had paid $500 million to purchase. This section here, Lucia said, her finger trembling slightly as it pointed to the Arabic text. This doesn't appear in the English version. It creates a value threshold trigger for operational control transfer, and the assessment mechanism is defined by a firm that appears to be connected to the seller. The room went very, very quiet. Patricia Chen stood up and came around the table to look over Lucia's shoulder. She couldn't read Arabic, but she could recognize when someone had found a bomb in the basement. Translate it, she said, word for word. Lucia did. her voice gaining strength as she went through the passage, explaining not just the words but the implications. The way the language was structured to sound like standard operational safeguards while actually creating a trap door that could swallow the entire deal. When she finished, Patricia looked at Khalid al-Hashimi's legal team with an expression that could have frozen fire. "Did you know about this?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. The head of Khalid's legal team, a distinguished older man named Hassan Kabani, looked genuinely shocked. He said something in Arabic, and Lucia didn't need the translator to understand it was a demand for an explanation from his own team members. What happened next happened fast. Jeremy Ashford tried to leave the room. Marcus's security consultant, a former military guy who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, blocked the door. Khalid al-Hashimi stood up, and when he spoke, even without translation, you could hear the anger beneath the formal politeness. Hassan Kabani grabbed the Arabic contract and started reading, his expression darkening with every paragraph. It turned out there were 17 different sections where the Arabic version contained provisions that didn't appear in the English text. 17 trapdoors, 17 hidden mechanisms, 17 ways for al-Hashimi Holdings to extract more value, more control, more power from the deal while Whitfield's company bore all the risk. The brilliant part, the part that would have worked if Maria Santos hadn't been restocking paper towels at exactly the right moment, was that the provisions were written in a very specific Gulf Arabic dialect, using legal terminology that was technically correct, but archaic enough that most modern translators wouldn't catch the full implications. Jeremy Ashford had counted on the certified translation service using standard modern Arabic protocols. He'd counted on nobody with deep dialectical expertise reviewing the documents. He'd counted on the fact that expensive American lawyers don't usually speak Arabic, and Arabic speakers don't usually understand complex American corporate law well enough to spot the trap. He hadn't counted on a cleaning woman who listened when she should have been invisible, and a college student who spent her nights studying the exact intersection of language and law that could expose the whole scheme. The deal didn't happen. Not that day. Not ever in that form. Khalid al-Hashimi was genuinely furious, not at the exposure but at the fact that his own contracted consultant had embedded fraudulent provisions that could have destroyed his business reputation across 3 continents. Hassan Kabani fired Jeremy Ashford on the spot and threatened legal action that would keep him in court for the rest of his natural life. Marcus Whitfield stood at the window, looking out at the city, processing how close he'd come to signing away not just $500 million but potentially control of the entire division that deal was supposed to launch. He turned to Maria and Lucia, and for a moment he just looked at them, these 2 women who had no reason to care about his fortune or his legacy, who had risked their own security to tell him a truth he desperately needed to hear. "I don't have the right words," he said finally. "Thank you seems inadequate. You just saved my company from a disaster I didn't even know was coming. You risked your jobs, your credibility, everything, to warn me about something you had no obligation to care about. Why? Why did you do it?" Maria glanced at her daughter, and Lucia glanced back, and something passed between them that was more than words. "Because it was right," Maria said simply. "Because you were always kind to me when you didn't have to be. Because my daughter is studying law so that people who clean toilets and people who sign $500 million deals both have someone who will fight for the truth. Because I've spent my life being invisible, and maybe that's okay, but I raised her to be seen and to see things that others miss. What happened after that happened in pieces, in boardrooms and law offices and late-night conference calls that spanned time zones. The fraudulent provisions were documented. Jeremy Ashford was arrested, eventually pleading guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges that would send him to federal prison for 7 years. Hassan Kabani and his firm underwent a complete internal investigation, discovering that Ashford had bribed a junior associate to insert the modified language under the assumption it would never be caught. Khalid al-Hashimi personally apologized to Marcus Whitfield and proposed a new deal, this time with triple the normal legal review, with multiple independent Arabic translators, with provisions so clean and transparent that a first-year law student could understand them. The deal eventually closed 6 months later for $475 million instead of $500 million, reflecting the damage to trust and the additional scrutiny costs. Marcus Whitfield established a new protocol requiring multilingual legal review on all international contracts, hiring a team that included native speakers of every language his company dealt with. But more than that, more than the business implications and the legal precedents and the news articles that called it the $500 million bullet dodged by a cleaning woman's daughter, Marcus did something else. He created a scholarship fund at Lucia's University for first-generation college students studying international law. He hired Maria full-time as a facilities manager with a salary that let her stop working nights. He offered Lucia a summer internship that turned into a job offer upon graduation in the legal department, working on exactly the kind of cross-cultural contract analysis that had saved his company. 3 years later, Lucia Santos stood in a different conference room, this one in London, representing Whitfield's company in a negotiation with a German manufacturing firm. She was 22 years old, the youngest person in the room by 15 years, and when she spoke, people listened. Not because of her age or her background, but because she'd proven that the smallest voice in the room could carry the most important truth. Maria watched her daughter sometimes when Lucia came home for holidays. When they sat in the apartment that was nicer now, in a neighborhood where the streets felt safer, where the schools looked like places where dreams got encouraged instead of managed. She watched Lucia practice her presentations, her translations, her arguments, and she thought about that morning in the Meridian Tower, about the choice between silence and speech, between safety and truth. She thought about how easy it would have been to keep stocking paper towels, to pretend she hadn't heard what she heard, to stay invisible the way the world preferred her to be. And she thought about how many other people, cleaning offices and driving taxis and delivering food and doing the 1,000 invisible jobs that keep the world running, heard things and saw things and knew things that could matter, if anyone was listening. How many truths got lost because the people who knew them didn't think they had the right to speak? How many disasters went unchallenged because the person who could stop them didn't believe their voice would carry far enough to matter? Marcus Whitfield never forgot either. He kept a photograph on his desk, taken the day the New Deal closed, showing him shaking hands with Khalid al-Hashimi, with Maria and Lucia standing between them. People asked him about it sometimes, visitors who didn't know the story, and he told them. Every time. He told them about the $500 million trap, about the Arabic provisions hidden in plain sight, about the cleaning woman and her daughter who saved him from his own certainty. He told them because he wanted them to remember that in business, as in life, the most dangerous assumption is that you already know everything you need to know. That the people who look powerless might be the ones holding the information that saves you. That arrogance is expensive, and humility, the kind that lets you listen to a college student in a hoodie when you're about to sign the biggest deal of your career, is priceless. The story spread, the way good stories do, through business schools and legal conferences, through journalism and documentaries. It became a case study in corporate due diligence, in cross-cultural business ethics, in the importance of diverse perspectives in decision-making. But it also became something else. It became a reminder that courage doesn't always look like you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a cleaning uniform making a phone call that could cost her everything. Sometimes it looks like a 19-year-old college student walking into a room full of millionaires and telling them they're about to make a catastrophic mistake. Sometimes it looks like choosing to speak when silence would be so much safer, so much easier, so much more in line with what the world expects from people who are just supposed to know their place. And maybe that's the real story here. Not just the fraud that almost happened, not just the millions that almost disappeared, not just the corporate thriller aspects that make it sound like a movie. Maybe the real story is about the decision to be seen when you've spent your life being invisible. About the decision to trust your own knowledge when everyone around you has more degrees, more experience, more money, more reason to think they know better. About the decision to act when action could break you, because the alternative is watching someone else get broken instead. Lucia tells the story sometimes too, when she speaks at universities, when students ask her how she built her career, how she got from a community college to a six-figure legal position before she turned 25. She tells them about her mother, always her mother first, about the example of someone who worked herself to exhaustion to build a better life, who never stopped believing that knowledge and courage could overcome the accidents of birth and economics. She tells them about that moment in the conference room, about the fear that made her hands shake, and the conviction that made her voice steady, about how close she came to apologizing and backing down and letting the adults handle it. She tells them that being right isn't always enough, that you also have to be brave enough to insist that people listen, smart enough to present your case in terms they can't dismiss, and human enough to remember that you're fighting for truth, not just for being correct. She tells them that the world is full of traps, some obvious and some hidden in Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C of documents that nobody reads carefully enough. That the people who set those traps count on your exhaustion, your deference, your assumption that surely someone else has already checked, surely someone else already knows. And she tells them to check anyway, to know anyway, to speak anyway. Because somewhere, in some building, in some moment that seems ordinary until it becomes extraordinary, someone is about to make a terrible mistake, and the only person who can stop them might be the person everyone assumes has nothing important to say. Now, if you made it this far, if you stayed with this story through all its turns and revelations and moments of truth, I need you to do something for me. I need you to type your country in the comments below, because I want to know how far this message has spread. How many different places have people who understand that power and powerlessness aren't always what they seem? I need you to hit that like button, because stories like this need to travel farther than the algorithm would naturally take them. I need you to subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep telling stories about the moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things, when the system almost breaks someone and they choose to break the system instead. And I need you to share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who thinks their voice doesn't matter, someone who's working invisible jobs and wondering if anyone sees them, someone who has information that could matter but doesn't think anyone would listen. Share it with them and tell them about Maria and Lucia. Tell them about the $500 million trap that almost closed. Tell them that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the truth everyone else needs to hear. Because that's how we change things. Not through grand gestures and dramatic moments, though those have their place, but through the accumulated courage of people who choose to speak when silence would be safer, who choose to act when inaction would be easier, who choose to believe that their knowledge and their truth and their fundamental human dignity matter more than the social hierarchies that say they should stay quiet and know their place. Maria Santos cleaned toilets. She also saved a fortune. Lucia Santos was a first-year law student. She also exposed a sophisticated international fraud scheme. They were invisible until they chose to be seen. They were powerless until they claimed their power. And they changed everything, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them, everyone who heard the story and thought maybe, just maybe, they could do the same. That's the truth buried in Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C of life. You're more powerful than they want you to believe, more knowledgeable than they give you credit for, more necessary than the system acknowledges. And the moment you realize that, the moment you act on that realization, that's when the real story begins.